So hi everyone. I'm gonna try to speed through this. My presentation, I'm gonna focus on issues and harms that are caused by the nuclear industrial complex. Specifically, I'm gonna be using the words nuclear imperialism and nuclear colonialism to talk about the nuclear industrial complex as a whole. First off, by nuclear imperialism, I mean our current geopolitical order, where nuclear superpowers hold dominant power over everyone else. So this refers to a geopolitical order where superpowers dictate the planetary conditions of life. By nuclear colonialism, I mean a system of domination through which governments and corporations target indigenous peoples and their lands to maintain the nuclear production process. So this manifests as entitlement to indigenous people and land, and an assumption that their sacred spaces and future generations are going to bear the costs of any nuclear activity. So I'm going to be focusing on three major issues, and through them, I'm going to make the argument that nuclear-free development requires forming alliances between indigenous, queer feminist, and demilitarization movements. And the three issues I'm going to focus on are colonial science, heteropatriarchy, and then militarization and its connections to colonialism. So I'm speaking from my perspective of my research on the TEPCO nuclear disaster. A lot of people know this as the Fukushima nuclear disaster. I call it the TEPCO nuclear disaster because Fukushima prefecture was not the only place impacted. As you can see from this map here, the fallout zone was not limited to Fukushima prefecture. It was all across eastern Japan. And furthermore, as we can see from this research on the kind of radioactive nuclides that have been leaking into the Pacific Ocean ever since, they have traveled through ocean currents all across the Pacific. All across the Pacific Ocean. Okay, so this is a global disaster. It is not limited to just Fukushima prefecture in Japan. So first off, colonial nuclear science. So I'm going to talk in this section, I'm going to talk about the issues with scientific research that has been done on the health effects of radiation. My argument is that colonial science established critical data sets that have formed the grounds of what we're allowed to claim in terms of the health impacts of radiation exposure. And this feeds into science that systematically produces specific blind spots, which is known as agnotological science or agnotology. And this has very serious implications for affected communities. So the most definitive data set that exists on the health effects of radiation comes from an American study that was done on atomic bomb survivors in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. This was called the Lifespan Study or the Atomic Bomb Survivor Study. It started out led by the US military during the US military occupation of Japan. Then it was funded by the Atomic Energy Commission, which is a direct descendant, institutional descendant of the Manhattan Project. So the study exhibited characteristics of colonial science that directly impacted the creation of its data sets and its conclusions. And I'll talk about 4 ways that it did that. First off, there were colonial and racialized divisions between researchers and researched. So the study started in a context where Japanese scientists were trying to publish their own preliminary research, arguing that the United States should be tried in The Hague for war crimes for the atomic bombings, right? It was research that was performed again under the US military occupation. And within that context, the American administrators and scientists who were conducting these studies viewed Japanese researchers as lacking the scientific knowledge, the objectivity, and financial resources to carry out their own medical studies of survivors. So there was an immediate power imbalance in terms of who was authorized to do the research in the first place. The second aspect is that data in colonial science, data and samples become the property of the colonial or occupying force. So research participants don't have access to their own medical histories, their own medical information. And generally that information is classified, as Lori just said, in the name of national security, which really means just so, nation states can maintain military advantages. So for example, in the case of this study, the total amount and type of radiation was kept a US military secret for a long time. American administrators and scientists controlled the data collection process. They censored leading Japanese experts on the biological effects of radiation. They confiscated blood and tissue samples from Japanese scientists and sent them to the United States for analysis. And as you can see in this interview quote here, they were not returned until 30 years later when the Japanese scientists could no longer do anything with the materials. So overall, data and tissue samples taken from affected communities were treated as the property of the US military, of the aggressor. And research participants were not given access to their own medical histories, as well as more ethical research that was being attempted by Japanese scientists was actively obstructed. The third aspect of colonial nuclear science is that this is research that is being performed for military and scientific aims. What this meant is that there's no medical care that is provided to affected communities, or there is a huge lack of emphasis on providing medical care. So the impact of this is that it turns people into specimens, and it treats the places that they live, the lands that they're from, as laboratories for scientific and military experimentation. And this is a huge parallel between, for example, Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the Marshall Islands, right? So no medical care was provided to survivors until 1957. Even once it was provided, there were exclusionary designations of who was a survivor. So as late as I think it was 2020 or in the last 5 years, atomic bomb survivors just won a lawsuit to finally be recognized as legitimate survivors because of this legacy. Women's accounts of the research process talked about how they experienced these scientific examinations as violations of their bodies. This is again a parallel with the accounts of Marshallese women. And the reason why this happens is because, again, the interest is in what kind of data can be obtained from affected communities. So scientists are not asking themselves, what is this colonized Korean woman's experience of the research process? What kinds of care does she need? Is the research we're doing ethically and culturally appropriate? Is the research process part of accountability, taking accountability for harms? Instead of those being the questions asked, what scientists are thinking about is what kind of data can be obtained from a biological female body? What kind of data can be obtained from a biologically male body? So they're thinking in terms of, it's a form of dehumanization based on reducing people just to their biology alone. And then finally, the fourth part is that this is tied to financial, military, and scientific investments in nuclear imperialism. So the initial research aims of this study were to understand how, for the US military to better understand how they could control, manipulate, and expand the effects of nuclear violence. So it was designed to understand how can we wage nuclear war with minimal harm to American soldiers, right? And from there, it did turn into a long-term study that was no longer directly controlled by the US military, but instead, now it was controlled by the institutional descendant of the Manhattan Project, which obviously was the institution or the project that produced the atomic bombs in the first place. So it could not be called an independent study by any means. So as a result, what were the impacts on the methodology? So if we take this is a very rough visualization. It's not like to scale or anything, but just as a visual aid. So first off, American researchers began the study 6 to 8 weeks after the bombings. And this is significant because by that point, most injured survivors had already died, right? So they started off their sample with maybe half of the, let's say half the people, right? And then from there, their dose estimations did not consider internal radiation doses, right? So it's a kind of lightening of that. And they also didn't include estimates of exposure to what they called residual radiation. Now they defined residual radiation as any radiation that is left after 1 minute after the bombs exploded. So this is a 67-year-long study that excludes any radiation that may have remained in people's bodies and in the environment from its entire purview, its entire scope, right? And then finally, they used exposed populations as control subjects. So the study should have looked, if we're thinking in terms of, control versus whatever, the scale should have looked something like this, right? There should have been a very clear contrast using actual control studies, including as many people as possible in the study, including the full extent of the doses that people were exposed to. And instead, they ended up with a study like this. And this is the most authoritative, most complete data set that exists on the health effects of radiation exposure. And the reason for it is because no institution besides nation states and these giant well-financed institutions have the resources to perform these kind of long-scale, enormous statistical studies. Okay, so this is just a summary of that. So further examples, this is not something that was limited just to Hiroshima and Nagasaki. There are further examples of this in the Marshall Islands with Project 4.1. The Atomic Energy Commission conducted 31 experiments on about 700 people over the course of 30 years. These were experiments that were conducted on elderly people, on prisoners, on hospital patients with terminal illnesses, some people with intellectual disabilities. There's the example of the Green Run experiment, where they intentionally released radioactive iodine to test its effects on people and the environment. So there's a clear pattern where nuclear imperialism requires this kind of dehumanizing scientific experimentation, not only to kind of gain knowledge about how to better develop nuclear weapons and nuclear energy, but also to then produce research that legitimates itself, kind of retroactively. And if anyone's interested, these are further resources that you can look at to learn more about this history. So what this means is that colonial nuclear science established the methodological and evidentiary standards for how we evaluate the violence of nuclear imperialism. This is a serious problem. This is not a model that was designed to seriously consider the health effects of chronic environmental radiation exposure. It was not a model that was designed to think about the blind spots that are created from how you engage affected communities in the research or not. And as a result, compensation lawsuits, criminal lawsuits from affected communities, regardless of whether they are from atomic bomb survivors, from nuclear disaster affected communities, if they are nuclear workers with occupational illnesses, uranium miners, their cases tend to get thrown out because of the legal enforcement of this imperialist military definition of what is a reasonable understanding of the connection between health and radiation exposure. So my kind of proposal in response to that is that the UN should lead an effort to establish feminist scientific and indigenous scientific methods as the legal standard for establishing whether environmental harm has taken place and evaluating the degree of environmental harm that has taken place in courts of law. So this would include things like treating health surveys performed by affected communities, the oral histories, testimonies, community-based research, as every bit as substantive, if not more so, than the statistical models that are a direct outgrowth and reproduction of colonial nuclear science. Okay, so part two, heteropatriarchy and reproduction. So this part is more focused directly on the research that I did. First off, heteropatriarchy is a system of oppression that defines and imposes gender in narrow and binary terms, sets roles and norms, and assigns power in accordance with that gender structure. It's a system that intersects and upholds other oppressive systems, so things like white supremacy, settler colonialism, capitalism. So it doesn't exist in a vacuum by itself. And the reason I focused on heteropatriarchy is because it defines womanhood through the reproductive value that women bring to nation states and to heteropatriarchal families. So my argument is that, or what I learned from my research, is that this heteropatriarchal investment in controlling women and their reproduction was the main mechanism that punished affected women for trying to create autonomous systems of radioprotective healthcare in the TEPCO nuclear disaster. Okay, so first off, so I'll talk about that in two ways. So first, kind of defining a woman's value to society through control of her reproduction puts women in the position of being responsible for all the care work in society, but not being in control of the conditions of that care work, right? So my question was like, okay, what happens when women try to assert their own visions of what care work should look like, or how society should respond to health issues that come from environmental discrimination. You know, what happens when women try to assert their own choices over their own care work or their own reproduction? And what I found in the TEPCO nuclear disaster is that they were punished for it and scapegoated as either violent and incompetent mothers or as uncaring wives. So in the nuclear disaster, many women experienced harassment, gaslighting, manipulation, shunning, sometimes physical violence from their in-laws, from their husbands and other relatives when they attempted to evacuate from affected areas with their children. So in the interviews that I conducted, women shared that they were told that they deserved to be left or cheated on by their husbands. This was said to a pregnant woman. They were asked who evacuated. They were asked, okay, if you're going to evacuate, well, who's going to make dinner for your husband? Well, how is he going to fend for himself, right? They were asked to return home after a brief period of evacuation because they were, talked about as a burden or as interrupting their relatives' domestic lives. And there were relatives who just stopped speaking to them completely, so they were shunned. And this same kind of punishment was enacted also in schools, in friendships, at doctors' clinics as well. In the case of doctors' clinics, they usually took the form of public humiliation for being an evacuee. So kind of announcing to the room, oh, I see that you're here using the kind of evacuee-only insurance, loudly enough that everyone could hear that that's what their status was. So meanwhile, as this was happening, the national government appointed representatives established a narrative that saturated the corporate media. And the narrative that they kind of pursued was that people who try to create radioprotective safety for affected communities are committing discriminatory acts of violence against nuclear affected regions. And the focus was on the economic value. So it's basically saying you're bringing down the economic value of anything that comes out of Fukushima Prefecture, and that counts as an act of discrimination. So this was a form of highly gendered scapegoating. Other feminist scholars of nuclear imperialism have already pointed out that anti-nuclear movements and environmentalist movements more broadly are frequently scapegoated through stereotypes about the feminine. So they're cast as irrational or crazy, paranoid, neurotic, naive, etc. In this case, it was said that people who cared too much about radiation had radiation brain, similar to radiophobia in Chernobyl. And this is counterposed to what nuclear imperialism tries to establish as an accepted norm, which is that continued investment in nuclear imperialism and colonialism and militarized ideas of security are supposedly the only things that will keep us safe in an increasingly dangerous world, right? And this is coded as a masculine trait and therefore by default more valuable. Okay, so the effect on women was that their organizing that they were doing in terms of public health and the environment was invalidated, it was stigmatized. The state legitimized anyone taking it upon themselves to punish these women. And so a lot of women kind of became clandestine in their efforts. So they hid what they were doing to avoid being found out by their families, by the people who were so close to them. Right, so in interviews and in research that's been done, there have been stories of women switching out their family's rice in the middle of the night, typing up their data from radiation monitoring, doing research on the health impacts of radiation in the middle of the night to avoid being found out, in some cases by abusive husbands, taking children to recuperation camps in secret, taking on the financial burdens for radioprotective healthcare in secret. And as they were doing this, they were, what they were actually trying to do at the time was to establish a really incredible model of what radioprotective healthcare could look like, a feminist radioprotective healthcare could look like, right? So they were sourcing and distributing safe food. They were doing their autonomous radiation monitoring that was controlled by the community. They were giving each other peer counseling. They were establishing recuperation camps for their children. They were providing access to supportive clinicians. They were educating people about all of this history and science. They were providing mutual aid to each other. They were supporting each other through domestic violence and helping the other women to escape their abusers. This was all of the organizing that was punished, that women were punished for. And the thing about it that I find very tragic or frustrating is that the government was in some cases surveilling some of these women. They were taking data on these women and kind of stigmatizing them a lot, but they didn't have to do it that much because their own friends and families and school administrators and local government officials were so ready to punish them for stepping out of the bounds of a supposedly proper motherhood, right? So the state didn't even have to step in to shut down this movement because other people were so ready to do it for them. The other aspect that I noticed in my research was marriage discrimination. So this results from the intersection of heteropatriarchy and eugenicism, where essentially because of eugenicism, families will view the potential reproductive health effects as something that could contaminate their lineages, could contaminate their family lines, instead of seeing it as harm or violence that has been done to a community, right? So this means that people will discriminate against potential romantic partners because they don't want their family to be associated with disability or illness. So it's fundamentally kind of the intersections of ableism and sexism. So this led to marriage discrimination, which has been recurring throughout Japanese nuclear history. It also led to silencing and stigmatization about miscarriages that took place after the nuclear disaster, and then other potential reproductive health impacts. So it makes it very difficult for women to get appropriate care for those things. Okay, so my proposal to this is that we should invest in public education and cultural transformation that emphasizes that gender is not defined by reproductive ability. This could be a point of unity between environmental feminists and queer and trans liberation movements. And I think it would form a powerful coalition that has been underexplored and unexamined, especially in anti-nuclear spaces. And I think could also be connected to like there always has to be some kind of mutual aid for supporting survivors of intimate partner violence if you want to provide any kind of real healthcare, feminist healthcare to people, and to support the environmental organizing that women are doing. Okay, so the last point is about demilitarization. This also kind of speaks to some of what Lori was talking about. So nuclear weapons were, on the rise, and nuclear power was on the rise in the 1950s, the 1960s. So we have to remember this was taking place as a massive struggle for decolonization, and social revolutions were taking place across Africa, Asia, and Latin America. So at the time, anti-colonialists, anti-racists, Pan-Africanists argued that nuclear weapons were a way of establishing imperial sovereignty and maintaining colonial relationships through force, through this technology that's designed for annihilation. So promoting nuclear energy in that context as peaceful was fundamentally connected not only to legitimizing that geopolitical order, but becoming another means for actually establishing it. So the Atoms for Peace campaign, for example, it had kind of three different aims. Number one, it was intended to erase the memory of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It was meant to normalize a nuclearized American empire. And then it was also designed to secure stable uranium supplies from client states. So it was about securing American dominance and control of an emerging industry that would benefit nuclear weapons production and military superiority. And it also happened alongside a program called Operation New Look, which resulted in the deployment of nuclear weapons all across the Asia Pacific. It led to the intense nuclearization of NATO countries, American client states, colonies in the Asia Pacific. So especially South Korea, Taiwan, the Philippines, Okinawa, Guam, and Hawaii. There were at least, I think it was like, at most, it was something like 3,000 nuclear warheads were stored across all of these places. And here you can see kind of examples of that. So there are also a lot of examples of former nuclear sites being turned into sites for military weapons testing and research. You can see this at the White Sands Missile Range, the Kwajalein Missile Range, And this is now also happening in Fukushima Prefecture. So the former evacuation zones are being used as sites to test out and research new military technology. In the context of Japan, it's also important to note that ongoing Japanese settler colonialism in Okinawa and the ongoing US military occupation of Okinawa is central to Japan's relationship to nuclear imperialism as a client state of the United States. So what this means for me is that demilitarization has to mean unequivocal support for opposition to all forms of nuclear power. And there cannot be any real nuclear-free development without a simultaneous support for indigenous self-determination and demilitarization everywhere. And I think this means that a kind of active relationship should be built with communities that are involved in this kind of demilitarization efforts. Okay, these are some other ideas that I had. And then we can talk about them later if people are interested. But in conclusion, I think these are the reasons my research has led me to conclude that the future of nuclear-free development lies in strategic alliances between indigenous, queer feminist, and demilitarization movements that have a shared analysis of nuclear imperialism and colonialism. Without this, I don't think that we will address the root causes of why nuclear harm is allowed to continue. And I also don't think we will have the ability to create enough collective power to put material weight behind demands for reparations. Thank you.